Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. My name is Paul Michael Anderson, and this is about bringing audience into student writing. Before we begin, I figured we'd have a warm-up writing activity because that's kind of common in these presentations, and mine I just call part of the trick. I'm going to tell you three things. You're going to need to have a sheet of paper to write on, and something to write with. And if you would, for me, please give yourself about 5 minutes. So whenever I'm done, I say describe sending, go, stop it, time yourself, give yourself 5 minutes. So the three bits of information I want you to have is that on a table, there's a rabbit in a cage. On the rabbit itself, in blue ink, the number 3 has been inked, is written. Now, describe the setting. Describe it all as much as possible in 5 minutes. The one thing I ask you to do is do not stop writing until the 5 minutes is up. Ready? Go. What'd you come up with? I love doing this activity. Now, if I'm going to be honest, I've never done it in an English classroom. I've done it in numerous writing workshops, which I'll get to in a moment. But I love hearing the responses from this because, as you would know, if we were in a group of adults or a group of participants, everyone's going to see something differently. In the past, I've had people who described a setting similar to a carnival. People have described it in a laboratory, in a food processing plant, which was an odd one. For me, oddly enough, I always kind of see it in what could loosely describe as an Italian restaurant. Hardwood floors. There's a tablecloth on the table. It's checked. There's a spotlight, yellowish, that shines down on the table. That's what I see personally. And the whole purpose of this is to show you the dynamic between writer and reader. Now, when you were listening to me talk, you were the reader. You were listening to what information I gave you. And then you went off and you created your own thing. It is independent of anyone else around you and is completely beholden to your own views, your own imagination, your own sensory information, all those things. And that is something we need to recognize as writers, as readers, and as teachers, that there is a power dynamic that goes on constantly. It is never ceasing between writer and reader. And they are more equal than you would think. Now, before we go any further, as you can see from the slides themselves, I call this portion an annoying autobiographical pause. It's basically where I show my cred. Just so we're all on the same page, I got my bachelor's in education, English education, from Clarendon University in Pennsylvania, 2006. I'm currently at work on my master's degree here at Shenandoah University. My first year teaching, I taught on the Maryland's Eastern Shore. I taught ninth grade preparatory. Then I was back in Pennsylvania teaching for 4 years at my alma mater. And I taught a mixture of alternative education, 9th, 11th, and 12th accelerating college prep classes. And then for the past 8 years, going on 9, I've been down here in Virginia. I teach in Warren County High School, which is the county's front row of the county seat of Warren County. I've taught everything from 9th to 11th, from regular to honors. I've also been the advisor for the newspaper. I'm on the leadership committee. I'm on curriculum development, yada, 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 yada. Lots of things. Speaking of Warren County, this is by far the smallest school I've ever taught at. For example, Penn Hills High School had a population of 2,500. That was my graduating school, very diverse. Warren County High School, as of the last census, has a population of 821. About half of the graduating class get advanced diplomas, but over a quarter of the students are eligible for free and reduced lunch. The demographics breakdown is 81.7% white, pretty white, with a very small multicultural population mixed between multiracial, Black, Hispanic, and Asian. While this is my first presentation given at a conference via virtual, is not my first conference or my first presentation. Since roughly 2007, I periodically give workshops or give presentations on publishing and writing at Pittsburgh Comic Con, Confluence, regional literary cons, and that's because since 2002 I've been a freelance writer, starting college, going on to today. Up until this point, I've had over 100 plus pieces, whether they're news stories, reviews, columns, interviews, yada yada yada. But on top of that, I'm also a freelance writer with over 4 dozen literary pieces published, and I get paid, which is always nice, including a number of books. Bones Are Made to Be Broken was my first book. It was a reprint collection. Then I wrote the novellas I Can Give You Life and How We Broke, the latter of which with Bracken McLeod. And actually, next Monday, my new book, Standalone, will be coming out. So I've been kind of doing this for a while. I've actually made a living with my writing. But ignoring all that annoying autobiographical stuff, because for some reason nothing makes me feel more awkward than talking about my other career, don't ask me why, is this idea of writing for audience, okay? Now, in most writing texts and with a lot of writing teachers, the purpose of their existence essentially is to try to get student writers, whether they be little ones or teenagers or adults, to find joy in writing, to find enjoyment in writing. But that tends to remove the concept of audience as an equal player in the discourse. This presentation serves to upend that, okay? This presentation seeks to illustrate, no, you cannot remove an audience from the writing process on any level. And with that comes a more intense focus on the skills of writing, less so the joy. The joy, if it's there, is going to be taken for granted. We acknowledge it, yay, it's there, but that's secondary to being able to wield the tools of clear writing communication. More to the point, the teaching writing must include the prospect of multiple audiences. Audiences that you would identify or relate to, but also audiences you might not, okay? And to that end, we have to recognize that word choice, structure, organization, grammatical knowledge, societal norms, and background knowledge, these all come into play. Moreover, we have to recognize power dynamics between the writer and the audience. Now, traditionally, when we read something from a writer, whether it's in a textbook or an article or a magazine, we silently assent that they are the hegemon. They are the wielders of the power. They are the ones providing the information. And student writers are no different. When they are writing a piece, whether it's narrative, expository, persuasive, argumentative, they are the hegemon. And we are training them to be the people who have the information and are bestowing on the audience. But the audience has a say. And that say is important because since we want them to understand, and if we're writing persuasive or argumentative, we want them to agree, we have to meet them on their level. So they wield a certain amount of power too. And as we go forward, that's what I kind of want to illustrate. If you haven't figured it out yet, this is less about a cute app or an interesting strategy I've come across and I want to illustrate, and more of an actual writing pedagogy, an entire different way of writing. This comes mostly from working as a freelance writer, but also being a student and being a teacher of English. I became an English teacher because I love teaching writing. I love working with kids to develop writing. But what I see more often than not is no matter how many cute prompts I come up with or how much freedom I give them, there are people who just muddle through. They take no joy out of it, and to that end, they don't develop the skills because they've decided they hate it. They're gonna hate it, and you can't change that. All right, well then screw it. I don't care if you hate it. This is still a valuable skill. Communicating clearly and effectively to whoever you want to talk to is something that everyone should know how to do. It's as fundamental as reading. So, with that in mind, we have to, by bringing audience in and making the writer aware of audience, we also make the writer responsible for their own writing. They're not looking to the teacher to, correct their knowledge. Well, no, you are the knowledge base. You know who you want to talk to. What do you want to say to them? How do you want to get your point across? And they take ownership of the writing. Through that, then, the teacher becomes a guide. Okay? We show them how, well, okay, if you say it this way, you're going to have this reaction. If you say it this way, you're going to have this reaction. If you forget to mention this, these questions are going to occur. If you say this too much, then there are no questions, but there's also no interest. And you are more guiding the student writing versus dictating it. Hope that's coming up clear. Let's move on. Before we go any further, we need some piece of writing so I can illustrate. I'm a very big, let's actually work with the concepts I'm working with here. So we're going to do something that I used to use in my fiction workshops. Fiction workshops, workshopping in general is great because it puts all the emphasis on whatever skills you're trying to show and has the group and the individual work within the group and with themselves. And you really truly do take a guide-like role. I'll be honest, what I'm going to do here, I've never actually used in the classroom. I've only used in fiction workshops. Mostly because, as we are all classroom teachers, we know that our curriculum tends to lean hard on research and response and things like that. Fiction writing does tend to fall by the wayside. Narrative fiction does tend to fall by the wayside, especially at the secondary level. But it's great, and I try to incorporate, even in my research writing, my essay writing, the big writing projects, I try to incorporate some workshopping in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a scenario. I'm going to ask you to write a narrative response to it. I say, you see there's a pause button there. Time yourself, give yourself about 15 minutes, okay, to write this. If you don't finish after 15 minutes, it's great. It's fine. We just need a piece of writing. Similar to Parlor Trick, I'm going to give you a little bit of information and let you kind of run with it. And we'll see where it goes. Maybe you'll come up with something. I used to do this with my fiction workshops because in those fiction workshops, it'll be illustrating things like dialogue, pacing, opening lines of good short stories, things like that. Because those people wanted to get into freelance writing, and someone had told them along the way they need to take classes in order to be a good writer instead of just following the basic advice of reading a lot and trying your hand at it. But the scenario I'm going to give you is the same I used to give them, and it goes like this. There are two people in a room. At the end of the scene, one will leave. What does that mean? What's going to happen in between the beginning of the scene and the end of the scene? That's up to you to tell me. Give yourself about 15 minutes, then we'll come back and we'll start actually using that text in order to do something with it. Now, keep in mind this is a virtual meeting, so maybe not literally, but we'll see where we can go. All right, let's bring it back in about 15 minutes. Welcome back. I love that activity personally, mostly because of the fact that one year I did this. This is going back 10 years ago now. I always do the activities with the kids and my students. These guys were all in their 30s when I did it. But I've never been one not to do an activity. And one time I came across, gave this one, and it ended up becoming a short story that I sold. Like, it was my quickest sale ever. I drafted it, sent it off. Within a week, I got a reply back. It was kind of ridiculous, but that really kickstarted my writing career, actually. So I have a soft place in my heart for it. But I had you do that because we need to talk about who you are comfortable reading the material to. Okay? This activity, and you'll see it in my my notes, my presentation packet, has to do with the fact of analyzing who a writer feels most comfortable talking to and who they don't, and why. And this is something I do with my classes. I do it with all my classes. Usually at the start of the year, right when we're starting to get really underway with some form of writing, some fairly sustained writing project. Mostly because I want them to be aware of who they're talking to. I'm introducing the concept of audience to some of these kids for the first time. They have never analyzed who they feel comfortable talking to. or who they don't feel comfortable talking to. It's innate, you know. For example, I've never analyzed why, but I get incredibly uncomfortable when my mother reads my published work. I've been a published writer now for almost for more than half my life, and it bugs me when my mother reads my articles or she's like, "I just read your new book." Please don't ever tell me that, mother. And she laughs and thinks, and fine, my wife thinks I'm ridiculous, but I'm never comfortable with it. Who am I comfortable talking to? Well, this is what this activity is. I always have my kids take a sheet of paper out, and I ask them 5 questions. Um, I'm not going to set a timer on this one. I'm not going to have you necessarily do it unless you feel you want to. It is in my presentation packet because, unfortunately, as we get closer to the end of this presentation, the more student participation, audience participation is required, and that kind of is limited in this venue. The first question I always ask my kids is, who are you most comfortable talking to? Tell me about them. And I would have them describe this person. It's usually a friend of some kind, maybe their girlfriend or their boyfriend, very common, especially in the high school. And they would tell me like if they had a job, or if they played sports, or how long they've known each other, or whatever. I have to be very clear here. I want them to tell me about that person, not why they are the favorite to talk to. Okay? Those are two different questions, but people in their heads conflate the two images. My first question is just tell me about the person you feel most comfortable with. Brother, sibling, parent, grandparent, neighbor, random hobo on the street, whoever. Just tell me about them. How'd you meet them? What are their hobbies? What's their astrological sign? You know, whatever. Just tell me about them. Get me a sense of it. Describe that person to me. My second question then would be, why are you most comfortable talking to them? And this is where that writing it down becomes very important because some kids, maybe there's a very personal reason why they trust that person to tell them things. Maybe it's a shared sense of loss or embarrassment, um, a, uh, a shared whatever. But it's something that I don't necessarily need them to broadcast. They're writing it down. They are analyzing it, they're articulating it in their heads and on the page. I don't necessarily need them to present. Now, throughout this, I am also doing the activity, like I say previously, and I will say my answers each time we are done. But I don't necessarily require anyone else to join me. If they do, I always throw it out there. Does anyone else want to tell me, hey, why is that person your favorite person to talk to? Um, just because I don't necessarily want. Can be very tricky, and it can go either way. Up to all the way to the end of the assignment, it can go multiple ways. It can get derailed very quickly. So after that, I go my third question. If you haven't figured it out, my third question will probably be, or is, who are you least comfortable talking to? Describe that person. And usually a parent. Maybe it's a bad teacher they had in seventh grade, or maybe it's just the concept of a stranger. Shy kids, you always get the idea of anyone I don't know. And if there are geeky kids, then and this is weirdly how stereotypical that high schoolers really are. And be like, if they're geeky kids, they can't talk to people they perceive to be popular or what have you. Really bizarre because I don't remember those stereotypes when I was a kid, but I see them in 80s movies all the time. And then my fourth question usually is, have you ever had an instance where you had to talk to someone you didn't feel comfortable talking about, and then tell me about it? Usually it's like, admitting they did something wrong. That's usually the answer I've gotten in the past. Again, you have to have your class atmosphere. This is one of those times where it's key. Class atmosphere is key for like classroom management and behavior issues and things like that. But it's also key when you have stuff like this because it takes a lot of trust among themselves and with you in order to even want to write it down on a sheet of paper. The fifth question would be, okay, usually this is why I tend to do it after we've picked a sustained writing project. For example, like a career they're gonna research they want to do, or a persuasive prompt they take. Okay, what would you focus on with your topic to get that person you don't feel comfortable reading or talking to read? That was a bit of a mouthful, so let me break that down. Say, for example, my students are researching a career, which is usually how I start the year, just kind of get them writing, get them thinking of research and organization, things like that. And say I have a student who is uncomfortable talking to, I'll actually use an example from last year. Um, I had a boy whose father, military family, Navy specifically. He did not want to be. Um, he didn't want to go into the Navy, even though they're big military Navy people. He wanted to um, actually be a video game programmer. Okay, and it wasn't like we all picture immediately the kid who spends all night playing Fortnite, not doing their work. This kid was an A student. He actually asked for a recommendation to the big gifted school, and I gladly wrote it for him. I can't remember if he got in, but I was like, and he was like, the person he was most uncomfortable talking to was his father, and the topic is his career, specifically video game programmer. Okay, so that fifth question is what would you tell your father about video game programmer that would make them listen to you? And that's a big one. And that kind of focuses not just on the topic themselves and not just on the dynamic that they have with that particular audience, but how do you bridge the gap? And that's the whole point, what we're going to talk about in a minute. And that's where if you scaffold correctly, you give yourself all tons of room, you have opened yourself up. One, you've improved and thickened the classroom atmosphere, but also you've gotten these kids to analyze audience in a real time, relatable way. Speaking of which, what you have here is a student work doing the exact thing I just outlined to you. This student, her nickname's Juju. Great kid. When I was making this presentation way back during the last school year before COVID locked down everything, she was enthusiastic. She's like, "You want to use my stuff?" I was like, "Yeah." Smart kid, funny kid. So these are the answers she came up with. I know it might be a little hard to see, but she laid out who are you most comfortable talking to, and she kind of got into it. She's one of my kids who already kind of has that joy of writing. A lot of writing teachers try to build up in students, and this is one of those times where it's like, okay, you're just kind of going over the show recap when everyone saw last week's episode. You know what I'm saying? Um, I used her because she has the clearest handwriting. I really wanted to actually use kids who hate writing, and I have them somewhere in my now disinfected classroom. Um, but those are the ones I'm more looking forward to. Juju though was great. She allowed me to use it because I knew everyone could read it. Okay, they've analyzed audience. They analyzed who they're comfortable with, who they're not comfortable with. Like I said, that activity would usually come midway through a sustained writing project of some kind, especially if it involves research. And they've now written. Okay, revision. Let's talk revision in terms of audience. Revision, as every teacher who's put in more than just student teaching knows, revision is a painful, painful place to be when you're a teacher and when you're a student. A lot of us have to work with kids who, in previous years, the idea of revision they were taught was exchange papers and, hey, this comma is in the wrong place, so they didn't capitalize this letter. All right, this is good. No attention paid to grammar or organization or information given. It's the bare minimum mechanics, and they grunt and groan their entire way through it. Because unfortunately, because a lot of these kids don't like writing, they have a very one and done mentality. They resist any kind of formative change to what they've written. With that in mind, I actually take I structure my revision process very similar in terms of number to journalism, because that's where I got my start. Journalism was always about structure, then facts, then polish, then it goes off. Each time it kind of goes back to the writer. It's an arduous process. I try to update it and keep it relevant for English classes. And one of the revisions I do is called tonal revision. Um, it's in my presentation. I forget the person's name, but a tonal writer is someone who tries to close the gap between how they speak and how they write. And when I was a kid, if I had a teacher tell me that, hey, I when I read your paper, it sounded exactly how you talk. I always took that as a compliment. It wasn't until like in the past 5, 10 years I realized that some people might have meant that as a negative. For me, I always take it as a compliment. Hey, you talk the way you write. I have narrowed the gap between my audible speaking voice and my written speaking voice because writing is always functioning at a handicap. We learn to speak years before we learn how to write. And so the foundational knowledge, the foundation of speaking is way stronger than writing. And unfortunately, we don't do ourselves any favors when we teach writing to really kind of bridge the gap. This is one attempt, okay? It also brings to mind what I said earlier in this presentation by pointing out that not every audience you get to choose. Now, you recall I asked those 5 questions. I had them think about who their ideal audience would be, who is their least ideal audience, how do they get that ideal audience to listen to what they have to say. But there's also just a very big gap of unknowns. I point out to kids every year, every paper they write, I'm probably going to be holding on to some to use as examples future on. And they know I'm telling the truth because I've pulled out previous year's papers to show them. I'm always on the lookout for more papers. So that, if nothing else, illustrates that they are writing for an audience they will not be able to comprehend. More to the point, tonal revision is fun because it really kind of illustrates for kids the difference between their eyes and their mouths. When you read sound, writers are their own worst editors. I do not care what anyone says. Writers are their own worst editors, and here's why. Your eye and your brain will constantly smooth out the rough edges of whatever you're reading. You forget a word, or you transpose 2 letters, or you tense shift. Your brain's going to correct that. Your brain's not going to notice it. Your mouth, on the other hand, is pretty much stupid. It will just say what it sees, what the eyes see on the page, with no real buffer between the two. A brain will correct the mistakes for you and not tell you. They'll just kind of like, hey, look away, children. The mouth will just say what it sees, and there are a lot that's not just spelling typos, but sentence structure. It's the vocabulary you choose. If you're using a lot of words you're not comfortable with, you're going to stutter more. If you're using sentence structures that aren't part of your regular speech, you're going to pause and dip and have to take breaths when you really wouldn't naturally have to. And so tonal revision is really fun for that instance. If you have a good class atmosphere, this is going to be a no-brainer. If you don't have a good class atmosphere, it's just a rough group, your mileage may vary. But the activity is, it needs a few things. You need to have trust among the classmates. That's why those 5 questions actually really help with that. You have to have a purpose. What are you looking for? And how easily it works and how much scaffolding is needed is dictated by the classroom atmosphere, as always. All right, and among the offered papers for this presentation is a sheet for tonal revision. The way I do it is thusly. The day before the tonal revision, I pull a kid aside and like, hey, do you mind doing this with me? Usually they're pretty game. So the day comes. What I do is I walk them through it. It's the closest I get to lecturing in a class is I'm walking them through explaining why. Because again, you have to have that trust. You have to have that purpose. They are going with how the paper sounds. Now, I tend to do this revision before any other revision. I want them to get the beats of how they want to talk down. Forget structure, forget facts necessarily. All that is kind of, or what facts need to come in, what facts need to go out. All that is kind of secondary when they don't even have the proper terminology of what they would use. So, what I do is I get the volunteering kid. Every kid has in the classroom has the tonal revision sheet so they can kind of see it, and I walk them through it. And here's how it goes: is while when you have two people, one person reads, one person listens. The person who's reading doesn't have to look at their audience, but they cannot read anything than what's on the page. And if time and resources permit, both people have a copy of the paper so they can follow along. The kid, the reader, reads the paper straight through. On that sheet of paper, on that sheet is given out to you, the tonal revision sheet, there are questions that the listener must answer before they read, as they read, after they read. Um, and while that's happening, they're also making notes or what suggestions. Again, there's a lot of scaffolding that goes in with this, and class atmosphere is kind of key. After one reader finishes up, the other person reads and they do it. At no time do they give their paper to the other person. Um, when they are finished, they bring the paper to me. I grade it, give them their points, and then I give it to the reader. Now, depending on the time available, I've had kids do it 3 times, get 3 different people to listen to your paper. Sometimes I can only do it with once. The examples you see here, while there is a Q&A sheet, sometimes we run out of space, so, here they go. They have some answers, some papers to read, or they write on extra paper. And that's how we do it. It's the first real clear sense of, are you reading, writing, are you speaking, writing the way you speak? Are you saying it in a way you want to? And are you, with this unknown audience, are you getting your point across? It's not the only revision we do, but it's the one that brings in as soon as possible the audience, and that's always important. Well, if we were in the classroom, we were all grouped together and not in the age of a pandemic, we'd actually do a total revision. We'd use the pieces you wrote earlier, and you would share it with someone else who you partnered up with, and you would kind of go over it. You tell each other stories, and there's nothing better than that. But obviously, we're not. Still, I hope this presentation has been helpful for you. I hope you've kind of started thinking about audience in a different way, especially when it comes to writing, about how quickly you can bring it into the writing process. My opinion is from the very jump. I have a little extra thing to show you if you're still a little unconvinced. But I hope you took something away from this. Thank you very much for stopping by. All right, as a little bonus of what I'm talking about here, we have make your own vocabulary quizzes. I don't know about your counties and your schools, but in Warren County, they actually have they have a vocabulary curriculum. The one we use is 10 words per unit, and there are worksheets that go along with it, like multiple choice and matching, and maybe a reading prompt. And at the end of the week, you get a multiple choice quiz, and I just can't stand it. I hate it with every fiber of my being. Mostly because that's not how I don't believe words are learned. Words are not learned through lists and matching. Words are learned through usage and reading and writing. Um, at the same time, though, I also needed a warm up, some kind of warm up activity that was consistent, that was routine, that would get the kids writing every day. And so, compromise being, all right, well, we're going to make our own vocabulary quizzes. So, what I do is every day kids come in, there's a word on the smartboard, and it's one of the vocabulary terms. I give them the term, the part of speech, the definition, and they get 5 minutes. They have to write a clear, concise sentence with context clues to show the meaning of the word. So if you say, if let's say the vocab term is eradicate, they would have to come up with a sentence like the uh, the mad bomber eradicated the old factory by planting dynamite on all the support columns, or something along those lines. Um, they can write about anything as long as it's class appropriate, and kids get really into it. What ends up happening is at the every day they get immediate revision back. Like I say, hey, this how so, or what's if their context clues are not clear. I check their grammar, I check their punctuation, check their spelling, all that kind of stuff. Here's an example sentence on the slide. Check plus meant they got full credit on that sentence. So what happens after 10 days, after 10 words? I'm saving the best sentences as we go. So every day I would, type up like 4 or 5 sentences the kids have come up with. At the end of 10 days, on the 11th day, I take the best sentence from each word, put it on a worksheet, give it back to them. Say, find these words based on the sentences. The vocab term will be italicized in the sentence. It's also another paper that is being offered to you along with this presentation example of the quiz. The quiz has changed sometimes by semester because kids are always giving me new sentences. And sometimes I'll be looking at a quiz and I'll be like, oh, that sentence doesn't work as well as I thought, either in practice or it's just out of date. And so I change it. So the quizzes are constantly changing. And it's not like I'm doing a ton of work. I'm copying and pasting from what kids have created. So it's not, I know a lot of teachers are like, oh, that's too much work. You're not reinventing the wheel, you're just updating. And the kids get into it, and plus it again shows that immediate honesty. These kids know that their sentences, if they're good enough, they're illustrative, they're funny enough, they'll end up on a quiz. They'll end up on a quiz that could last a semester, could last a year, but it's gonna be read by dozens of people. And the kids get into it. The kids love it when they see one of their own sentences on the quiz. Sometimes they'll say it out loud in class after the quiz, like, "Oh, you used one of my sentences." More often than not, they draw like an arrow in the margins of the quiz, saying, "Hey, you used my sentence. Cool." But the kids ultimately get into it, and it illustrates all the concepts I've been trying to show you this entire time. Other sentences from the vocabulary. The one on the top, the cows eradicated the house because they took all the cookies. That student, she wrote a series of sentences about a cow being bemused at the farmer owner. It was kind of bizarre, but it was funny. I've had kids write about tell a story a sentence at a time through vocab warm-ups. They eventually get bored after like the second or third week, or second or third unit. But the kids get in again. The kids get into it. And if kids are getting into writing, even if it's something as simple as a vocab sentence, I'm not going to get in the way of that because they're taking what they're seeing, they're writing about it, and they're being aware of an audience, and that's kind of the whole point. Anyway, I hope you pulled something from this presentation. I will be around to answer any questions or what have you, and thanks for stopping by. Talk to you later.